The Johnstown Flood. It's May 31st, 1889 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. A 40-foot wall of water descended on the valley without warning. By the time it subsided, 2,209 people were dead. The South Fork Dam had failed, but this was no act of God. The dam was owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, an exclusive retreat for some of the wealthiest industrialists in America, like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. These men had purchased the old reservoir dam and modified it for their leisure. They lowered the dam's height to accommodate a road for their carriages. They removed the discharge pipes that would have allowed controlled water release during heavy rains and covered the spillways with fish screens to prevent their stocked base from escaping. Locals and businessmen had warned the dam was dangerous for years, but the club ignored them all. When the rains came that spring, the dam had no way to relieve the pressure. At 3:10 in the afternoon, the dam gave way. 20 million tons of water roared toward Johnstown at 40 miles per hour, picking up debris, locomotives, and houses along the way. The wave hit the town with the force of Niagara Falls. Entire families were swept away in seconds. At the stone bridge, a massive pile of debris accumulated and caught fire. Survivors who had escaped drowning found themselves trapped in the wreckage as flames consumed them. The screams could be heard throughout the night. The club's lawyers blamed nature, calling it an act of God. But in reality, they escaped paying a dime because of legal loopholes. And no member was ever held legally responsible. No damages were ever paid. The Peshtigo Fire. October 8, 1871, the same day the Great Chicago Fire happened, there was a far more deadlier fire destroying the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Between 1,200 and 2,500 people died in that fire. Note, this is not the exact number because the town's records burned with everything else. The superheated air rose so rapidly that it pulled in surrounding oxygen with hurricane force, creating winds that lifted houses into the air. The fire moved faster than people could run. Survivors described a wall of flame that materialized without warning, preceded by a roar like 1,000 locomotives. Some jumped into the Peshtigo River and survived only by submerging themselves repeatedly throughout the night, coming up for air between waves of heat. Others who stayed underwater too long drowned. Those who raised their heads at the wrong moment had their lungs seared by superheated air. The causes were entirely preventable. Extreme drought had turned the forests into kindling. Logging companies and railroads had been clearing land through slash-and-burn methods for years, leaving piles of dry brush scattered across the landscape. Small fires had been burning for weeks. No one coordinated to stop them. While it was much deadlier, you probably didn't hear much about this fire, since the Great Chicago Fire stole all the spotlight that day. The Galveston Hurricane. On September 8, 1900, a Category 4 hurricane struck Galveston City in Texas with 145-mile-per-hour winds and a 15-foot storm surge. Approximately 8,000 people died, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. At the time, Galveston was one of the wealthiest cities in Texas. Its highest point stood only 8.7 feet above sea level. Cuban meteorologists had tracked the storm and issued warnings, but the U.S. Weather Bureau dismissed their concerns, assuming the hurricane would curve toward the Atlantic. It did not. The storm surge submerged the entire island. There was nowhere to run. In the aftermath, the city faced an impossible problem. Thousands of bodies littered the streets and beaches. To prevent disease, survivors initially weighted the corpses and dumped them at sea. But then the bodies washed back ashore. They had to be burned in massive pyres on the beach. The city's response was extraordinary. Engineers built a 17-foot concrete seawall and performed what became known as the Great Grade Raising. They literally jacked up thousands of buildings, some weighing 3,000 tons, to raise the city's elevation. St. Patrick's Church was raised while people were still inside the building. The San Francisco Earthquake. On April 18, 1906, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck the San Andreas Fault at 5:12 in the morning. The official death toll was listed for decades as 498. That number was a lie. City officials deliberately suppressed the real count to maintain investor confidence and protect real estate values. Modern historians estimate the true toll exceeded 3,000 dead. The earthquake itself was devastating, but the subsequent fires caused 90% of the property damage. Broken gas lines ignited blazes across the city. Firefighters found themselves helpless because the earthquake had ruptured the water mains. The military attempted to create fire breaks using dynamite, but many experts now believe this tactical decision actually spread the fires rather than contained them. The fires burned for 4 days. 3/4 of the city was destroyed. Over half the population was left homeless. The disaster eventually led to America's first major building codes for seismic activity and shifted the West Coast's financial center from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in Manhattan. In 18 minutes, 146 workers were dead. Most were young immigrant women, some as young as 14 years old. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building. When the fire started, workers rushed to escape, only to discover that the exit doors to the stairwells had been locked from the outside. Owners locked the doors to prevent unauthorized breaks and to stop workers from stealing scraps of fabric. Those who could not reach the single unlocked exit faced impossible choices. Some jumped from the windows. Witnesses on the street watched as women fell to their deaths, their hair and clothes on fire. The fire department's ladders reached only to the 6th floor. The factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were charged with manslaughter. They were acquitted because the jury could not prove they personally knew the doors were locked that day. The men later collected $445 per victim in insurance payouts. They paid out only $75 per victim in the subsequent civil settlement. They profited from the deaths. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Between 1918 and 1920, an H1N1 influenza strain swept across the globe in 3 devastating waves. In the United States alone, approximately 675,000 people died. Unlike typical influenza, which kills the very young and very old, this strain disproportionately targeted healthy adults between 20 and 40 years old. Strong immune systems mounted such violent responses to the virus that patients essentially drowned in fluid produced by their own lungs. The pandemic's spread was accelerated by World War I. Crowded troop ships became super-spreader environments. Soldiers carried the virus from camp to camp, from continent to continent. The tragedy was made worse by deliberate censorship. Under the Sedition Act of 1918, American officials and newspapers were prohibited from publishing anything that might undermine morale. The flu's severity was systematically downplayed. Public health responses were delayed by weeks. By the way, the pandemic did not originate in Spain as the name suggests. Evidence suggests it likely started in Kansas. But Spain was neutral in the war and did not censor its press. Because Spanish newspapers were the only ones reporting honestly about the outbreak, the disease became associated with them. The 1925 Tri-State Tornado. On March 18, 1925, a single F5 tornado touched down in Missouri and stayed on the ground for 219 miles, cutting through Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana over 3.5 hours. It remains the longest track tornado in recorded world history. When it finally lifted, 695 people were dead. In 1925, the U.S. Weather Bureau had an official policy that banned the word tornado from weather forecasts. Officials believed that using the word would cause public panic. So when the storm approached, residents received warnings only of strong winds. Many had no idea what was coming until the tornado was already on top of them. The town of Murfreesboro, Illinois was hit hardest. The tornado struck at 2:34 in the afternoon when schools were in session and factories were running. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated. The storm moved so fast, traveling at 60 miles per hour, that some victims never heard it approaching. After the disaster, the government was forced to lift the tornado word ban. The attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack against the United States Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed. Nearly half of those deaths, 1,177 men, occurred on a single ship. The USS Arizona was struck by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the forward deck and ignited the ship's magazine. The explosion was so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton battleship out of the water. The attack ended decades of American isolationism overnight. Congress declared war the following day. The United States entered World War II. The USS Arizona still rests at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. It still leaks between 2 and 9 quarts of oil every day, more than 80 years after the attack. This phenomenon has been called the Tears of the Arizona. Some survivors of the attack requested that their ashes be placed inside the sunken wreckage so they could rest beside their shipmates for eternity. Hurricane Katrina. On August 29, 2005, a Category 3 hurricane made landfall on the Gulf Coast. The storm itself was not unusual for the region. What followed was the federally built levee system protecting New Orleans failed catastrophically. 80% of the city flooded. When the water receded, 1,833 people were dead. The Army Corps of Engineers later admitted that the levee system was a system in name only. It had design flaws, missing segments, and inadequate maintenance. The response was hampered by a breakdown in communication between city, state, and federal officials. No one seemed to know who had authority to act. While victims waited on rooftops for rescue, officials argued over jurisdiction. The Cajun Navy, a volunteer group of private boat owners, stepped into the void and saved thousands of lives. The disaster exposed deep inequalities in American society. The poorest neighborhoods, often majority black, were built on the lowest ground and flooded first. They were also the last to receive help. September 11th. At 8:46 in the morning of September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon at 9:37. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03. after passengers fought back against the hijackers. By the time the towers collapsed, 2,977 people were dead. The attacks were carried out by 19 hijackers affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The 9/11 Commission later identified a failure of imagination by American intelligence agencies who had not anticipated that commercial aircraft could be weaponized in this manner. Critical intelligence was not shared between the CIA and FBI. In the hours after the attacks, a civilian boat lift evacuated between 500,000 and 750,000 people from lower Manhattan by water. It was the largest maritime evacuation in history. The long-term consequences have been staggering. More people have now died from 9/11-related illnesses, respiratory cancers, and lung disease caused by toxic dust than died on the day of the attacks itself.